This is the 1898 illustration by Ludwig Heinrich Heine, titled Also a Crown. And when we first look at this image, it's fairly instant that we would attribute the crown as representing the promise of status, power, fulfilled ambition, dangled by a cosmic joker, jester figure towards a desperate, clambering, grasping crowd, which we could probably expand out to say, the public, the population, regarding that crown as a fulfillment, a kind of remedy to the deficit of whatever they're experiencing. And I think that's evident, and I think that's fairly explicit. It's a kind of surface level of what this image represents. But I would also say that it's going beyond that, and the potency of this image actually goes, it's pervasive in terms of human experience, right down to the most profound elements of it, even to a grandiose term such as spirituality would be, the spiritual would be appropriate here, in terms of the pitfalls that could be associated. So what do I mean by that? There are also psychological and neurological corollaries with this, so I will explain that too. So we've got, capitalism comes up, of course, when we look at that image, I would say, as a kind of, let's say, a social phenomenon on the social level of what that image is representing. And of course, we've got modern day corollaries as well that would be correlating with, for instance, older versions of aspirations such as fame, such as wealth and position, because of course now we have like a social media version of that in terms of being a dominant influencer in some way, getting sponsorship, like that kind of, which was kind of a bit more, well, it was rare other than a few celebrities, the idea that one would be sponsored or get sponsored for things. Now it's kind of like the standard aspiration for someone that's in social media is to be looking for that kind of income. And then celebrity worship is also a kind of emergent property of a system that is externalizing, the promissory aspects of materialism. But then we also have kind of more on an ideological basis, we could say there's political corollaries that come with this as well. I've mentioned capitalism, and that would work via consumerism, via wealth, of course, via prestige, via the individualistic kind of perspective on a human being. But then if we go to the kind of, let's say, the opposite end of the scale towards more collectivism, then utopianism tends to emerge as the kind of ideal image that can come out. And regardless of how they may compete or contradict each other in terms of a direction and in terms of implementation, they both represent an external adjustment, tweaking, assembly of the social and physical environment also. And when we're talking about psychological and neurological corollaries, well, we always keep coming back to a left hemispheric McGill Christian perspective, on the left hemisphere, that it's always seeking to remove nuance. It's looking to close down on a certainty. it's reductionist by nature, and that really means that because nuance is taken away, the full context, the full relationship of what's occurring, how things all fit together, how they interact, etc., can often be removed, or, well, let's say ignored. Whereas the right hemisphere is always looking to explore and kind of open up to a fuller understanding, a more contextualized understanding. So this crown, in a way, represents the externalized version of the world that we think is going to bring us some kind of, let's say, remedy, relief, or even ideal situation. And then, when I say it's a spiritual pitfall, it's also that if we're talking about a reification, if we're talking about externalizing something, then that can also come through the kind of tendency we can often see where people they'll attend church, they'll attend temple or synagogue, etc. They will attach and kind of label themselves a certain denomination or a certain religion. But then when it comes to, and that's not a criticism of people that may do that, I'd say the pitfall is when someone is doing that, but they're not paying any attention to their internal experience or to their internal disposition. And of course, that can also then translate to behaviors as well. But we're talking about, oh, well, it's good enough that I, do this external gesture or ritual of going to the particular place on a Sunday or a Friday or whatever it happens to be. And then I also call myself that, and that's enough. But of course, that's missing the entire point of all spiritual systems, you could say, is really about attending to the inner phenomenological experience of something. And, this is kind of explicitly laid out in, for instance, Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism, and, other dharmic, Jainism. We have the phrase neti neti, neti neti, and we have nama rupa, via vihara. And neti neti means not this, not that, as in it's not this, it's not the name, it's not the body, it's not the kind of the things that you try to find a definition through, which is nama rupa, which means name and form, name and body. And in Buddhism, there's, the analysis of the five skandhas, the heaps, the different kind of composite parts of what are seen to make up the self. And then there's the principle of anatman that the Buddha described. And, on a deeper level than what we're talking about the tendency to reject ambiguity and uncertainty and seek out something to have a relationship with as a form to grasp onto, to kind of attach ourselves to, so that if that's there and I can experience that, then I'm okay, I'm substantial. I'm not nebulous, I'm not vague, I've got some kind of definition, and it's this, And in terms of the sort of more meditative traditions, that's what's challenged to its, much deeper level in terms of where the ego, really, so to speak, takes refuge in attachments to the concepts, attachments to the conceptual mind in general. In Sanskrit, that's buddhi, not Buddha, but buddhi is, the faculty of the intellect to kind of be discriminating and to think and play around with propositions and processing concepts in general. And so meditation, in part, is aimed at removing the tendency towards attaching to your conceptual experience. It's not to necessarily obliterate conceptual experience in itself. That's the common kind of complaint or comment on people who first encounter meditation is, oh, well, I can't stop thinking. And the nuance of that, speaking of nuance, is that that's never really been a requirement. The requirement of meditation is much more about, let's say, observing our relationship with conceptual processing in general. It's not that it's happening, it's how you're engaging with it and what you draw from it in terms of a definition, in terms of using it as a dualistic device to establish your experience as being substantial via concept. And then, of course, the ultimate sorry, I just knocked the camera there. The ultimate objective is to recognize the true nature, to recognize the essence of consciousness, and then, of course, the recognition that one's experience of consciousness is no different than the infinite, no different than the infinite consciousness. And that would be, in Buddhism, that would be like the Tathagatagarbha, the Buddha nature. In Hinduism, that would be recognizing that the Atman and the Brahman are one and the same, or at least through the Advaita sort of non-dual traditions. So that's why I say this image. I know it seems like I've gone off on one and gone completely away from the image, but the image is, I would say, representing the pitfalls of reification, the pitfalls of overly attributing definition and seeking out definition through external means. And if we can talk about materially external, we can talk about ideological externalizations. But in terms of the dharmic systems, and I can't really talk for Christianity because I don't know it in depth enough. Certainly the St. Thomas Gospels have got quite a lot of esoteric things going on there in terms of, they seem to be far more, let's say, orientated towards corollaries that you could say are more Eastern systems. Of course, Christianity is an Eastern system as well originally, but it's been kind of established in the West for long enough that people often refer to it as a Western religion. But there are no Western world religions, at least. So anyway, I think I've got my point across. I'm probably hammering it a bit too much here, but yeah. So just my point being is that this image, I think, is deeply profound and worth reflecting on and contemplating and meditating on in the sort of more Western kind of definition of the word meditating. I don't mean I'm not talking about vipassana, etc. Anyway, I thought I'd share that.